The only beneficiaries would be the terrorists and extremists, seeking to use the chaos as cover to advance their abhorrent objectives. So we are urging all people, all parties, to de-escalate as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the safety and security of British citizens and our interests in the region are of paramount concern. The Foreign Commonwealth Office has strengthened its travel advice to both Iran and Iraq and will keep it under constant review. We urge British nationals in the region or those intending to travel to regularly check government.uk for further updates. And we have taken other urgent measures to protect British nationals and interests. The Department for Transport are reviewing the threat state and advice to Red Ensign shipping on a daily basis, and supported by the Ministry of Defence, we will issue guidance imminently. And at the same time, Defence are changing the readiness of our forces in the region, including helicopters and ships on standby to assist if the need arises. To ensure the safety and security of our personnel, we have also relocated non-essential personnel from Baghdad to Tajik. Coalition forces in Iraq, including British forces, have suspended all training activities, and as part of prudent planning, a small team has been sent to the region to provide additional situational awarenesses and contingency planning assistance. Mr. Speaker, on the 5th of January, Iraq's Council of Representatives voted to end permission for coalition activities in Iraq. As the vote is only one part of the process, we are in discussions of what those implications mean with our Iraqi interlocutors. Today, I would simply remind the House that the coalition is in Iraq at the request of the Iraqi government to help protect Iraqis and others from the very real threat of Daesh. Our commitment to Iraq's stability and sovereignty is unwavering, and we urge the Iraqi government to ensure the coalition is able to continue our vital work countering this shared threat. Mr. Speaker, the main focus of the UK government is to de-escalate this issue. None of us wants conflict. None of us wants our citizens, our friends and our allies to be put at risk. My right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, from the outset, has spoken to President Trump, President Macron, Chancellor Merkel and President Erdogan, and will continue to engage with other world leaders. The Foreign Secretary and I have been talking to our counterparts, and only this morning I met with His Royal Highness, the Saudi Vice Minister for Defence, and in tandem we are working with the E3 to reboot the Jcpoa, the nuclear deal, which we believe is a vital step to achieving a more stable Iran. And in the coming days, we will be doing all we can to encourage Iran to take a different path. No one should be under an illusion that long before the death of General Soleimani, Iran had stepped up its destabilising activities in the region, whether it was targeting dissidents in Europe or hijacking civilian ships. This aggressive behaviour was never going to go unchallenged. Her Majesty's government, Mr. Speaker, urges Iran to return to the normal behaviour of the country it aspires to be and resist the urge to retaliate.
Yeah. The Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for an advance copy of his statement. Could he tell us where the Prime Minister is? And what is he doing that's so much more important than addressing Parliament on the assassination of Iranian General Qasem Soleimani? An extremely dangerous and aggressive act that risks starting yet another deadly war in the Middle East. On Friday, I sent the Prime Minister a letter posing a series of questions. He has not answered any of them. Instead, today, he's hiding behind his Defence Secretary. Isn't the truth, Mr. Speaker, that he's scared to stand up to President Trump because he's hitched his wagon to the prospect of a toxic Trump trade deal? Instead, Mr. Speaker, at this highly dangerous moment, we find the government giving cover and even expressing sympathy for what is widely regarded as an illegal act because they're so determined to keep in with President Trump. This assassination puts British troops and civilians, as well as the people of the region, in danger. Mr. Speaker, as the Secretary of State for Defence will confirm, I've long spoken out against the Iranian government's human rights record. including when he and I visited Iran together in 2014. This is not a question of Soleimani's actions or record on the region. Whatever the record of any state official, the principle and the law is that we don't go around assassinating foreign leaders. Without the clear demonstration of an immediate threat, it is illegal. So does the government regard the assassination as legal under international law? If so, how? And do the lawyers in the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence regard it as legal? If he really believes this was an act of self-defence, what evidence has he or the Prime Minister seen of the imminent attack on the US? He says the US is confident attacks were imminent. But US officials have been quoted in the press saying that the evidence is, quotes, razor thin. How would he describe it? In the past few days, the US President has threatened to target Iranian cultural sites. To attack Iran in that manner is, to quote him directly, disproportionate. Both these actions would be war crimes, and yet the government still seems unable to condemn such threats. On Sunday, the Foreign Secretary said the onus was entirely on Iran to de-escalate. I wonder, if Iran had assassinated an American general, whether the British government would be telling Washington that the onus was entirely on the US to de-escalate? Mr. Speaker, we talk about this as a conflict between the US and Iran, but the worst consequences are likely to be felt by Iraq, a country on the brink of further terrible violence and instability. President Trump has threatened Iraq with sanctions like they've never seen before, after its elected parliament, yes, elected parliament, voted to ask the United States and other foreign forces to leave their country. And he has said he will not withdraw entirely unless the US is compensated for the extraordinarily expensive airbase that was actually built by Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. The Prime Minister, when he finally resurfaced from his trip, said he was committed to the sovereignty of Iraq. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the government will respect Iraqi sovereignty if the Iraqi government asks all foreign forces, including British forces, to leave? Mr. Speaker, we know the British government wasn't consulted by the Trump administration in advance, despite there being obvious British interests at stake. I ask also, what is the government doing to secure the release of Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe and other dual nationals currently in detention in Iran? This must be an utterly terrifying time, both for them individually and for their families. It's not in anyone's interest for this to escalate to an all-out war. All sides should exercise maximum restraint and allow for meaningful dialogue led by the UN Secretary-General's office. To prevent war, we need a strong plan for diplomacy. So is the government in contact with the UN Secretary-General? And let's not forget, Mr. Speaker, that there was a diplomatic plan, the Iran nuclear deal. It was working until President Trump came along and tried to rip it up. Mr. Speaker, time and time again over the last 2 decades, the political and military establishments have made the wrong call on military interventions in the Middle East. Many of us opposed the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the failed invasion of Afghanistan, and I opposed the bombing of Libya in 2011. Have we learnt nothing from those events? This House must rule out plunging our country into yet another devastating war at the behest of another state.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I noticed, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition's actually letter to the Prime Minister in which he posed 3 questions to the Prime Minister, none of which of those questions he just posed from the dispatch box. So I think that was rather interesting. I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, instead of getting a serious interrogation of the situation about how we are going to de-escalate this situation in the Middle East, how we are going to make sure British citizens and British allies are secure, we've had the usual tripe about this is about Trump, this is about America, and all the anti-American, anti-imperialist guff that we've had from it. The Leader of the Opposition asked where the Prime Minister is. Well, funnily enough, the Prime Minister is running the country, Mr. Speaker, something the Leader of the Opposition will fail to ever do as a result of the election. And this Prime Minister actually believes in a cabinet government and letting the members of the cabinet who are responsible for their policy come to the House to be able to answer the questions around the policy matter. And indeed, as the Secretary of State Defence, who has a significant number of assets in the region, in Iraq at the moment, and is charged with the duty of defending this country, the Prime Minister felt it was appropriate for me to attend to answer the questions in his place. I think we could perhaps answer some of the questions. What few questions were made by the Leader of the Opposition. First of all, it is for the United States to answer in detail to whether it views the intelligence it made its decision on are whether illegal or not. From the information and intelligence that I have seen, what I could say is that it is clear there was a case for self-defence to be made about an individual who had come to Iraq to coordinate murder and attacks on US citizens. It begs the question, Mr. Speaker, what the Leader of the Opposition would do if that individual had come to Iraq or anywhere else to plot the murder of British soldiers and diplomats. Perhaps, like he recommended with al-Baghdadi of ISIS, he would seek to have him arrested at that particular moment in time. It is, of course, the case that this government is engaged in a full diplomatic effort at all levels to seek to de-escalate the tensions that have grown in the region. Indeed, not only at the United Nations, but in leader-to-leader, defence sec and foreign sec, and all other levers we have, broader than just in the region, to seek efforts to make sure that both Iran does not retaliate in any way that would escalate the situation, and indeed that our friends and allies do not escalate the situation either. The call that this government is making is to make sure that we pause, that we focus on the safety of the peoples of that region and seek a way out, both for Iran and indeed for its neighbours. The first way we can do that, and this government is determined to try and do that, is make sure that the destabilising activity that has been going on in that region is ceased, so we can all progress to find a solution to the conflict that we desperately want. In the meantime, this government will get on and make sure it keeps people safe in the region, and we will do everything we can to protect them and their lives.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Thousands of Iraqi civilians, military personnel and cadets have lost their lives in Daesh-linked violence, many brutally executed. In light of these events and the recent statement from the Combined Joint Task Force for Operation Inherent Resolve, could my right honourable friend reassure this House that the fight against Daesh remains offensive, not defensive, and update us on efforts to secure access to northern Syria for humanitarian actors and others, given that access via Iraq is now impossible?
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend makes a very serious point that Daesh has not gone away, is indeed posing a threat both to us here in the United Kingdom and Europe, but also within region. We are working incredibly hard with the Iraqi government to try and see what ways we can remain in theatre to deal with that. And I know that the Prime Minister spoke recently to the Iraqi Prime Minister, including on that subject. At the same time, in Syria, we are, of course, at the moment focused on the force protection of aid workers and everybody else in that region, making sure that people are safe and people that are travelling there do so with the right advice. It would not be right for me to comment any further on what we're doing operationally, both in Iraq and elsewhere in the region, because to do so may expose our forces. But we are very alive to the fact that the people, one of the group of people most likely to exploit destabilisation of the terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the State Secretary for advance sight of his statement. These benches, of course, hold no candle for General Soleimani or indeed the actions of the Iranian government. But I would simply say to the Secretary, it's not anti-American to question and press the government on what it's doing in relation to its closest ally. The Secretary says that the US is confident that General Soleimani had coordinated the 27th of December attacks and was planning further attacks. But I ask him, how confident is he that that is correct? Because there is certainly no consensus on Capitol Hill amongst congressional leaders that that is the case. Can I ask the Secretary, he mentioned he had seen the intelligence that perhaps has convinced him, but has the UK government done its own legal analysis on whether or not the strike was lawful? I ask him simply, does he believe that the strike was lawful? And can I ask him why it's taken 4 days for the government to convene the National Security Council, given the gravity of the situation we now face? And on UK forces, he tells the House, and this is the killer paragraph, Mr. Speaker, he tells the House that all training has been suspended and there is contingency planning going on, which can be taken to mean planning to leave Iraq. So can it be taken as read that there is now no active fight against ISIS in Iraq because of the actions of the President of America? And on de-escalation, Mr. Speaker, will he mount the most robust and unapologetic defence of international law and order? Does he agree with the International Committee of the Red Cross that the threat to target cultural sites, as has been made by the US President, would be unlawful? Will he get working to ensure that the UN Security Council can finally step in and do its job? And will he condemn the fact that the Foreign Minister of Iran has been prevented against international law from taking part in UN proceedings? And on the Jcpoa, I welcome what he has to say, but we really need some detail as to how he will get that resurrected with Iran and with the United States. Mr. Speaker, we hear a lot at the dispatch box about the international rules-based order. Our closest ally, whether we like it or not, is ripping that up before our eyes. I ask him to be unapologetic in standing up for it, mount the most robust defence of it. America is a close friend. This is what a close friend should do, and if he does that, he'll have the support of these benches.
The honourable gentleman asked some good questions, if I may answer. And first of all, we of course would condemn any attacks on heritage sites and do recognise that would be against international law. My counterpart, Secretary of State Mark Esper, the US Defence Secretary, has already clearly said that the US will not target heritage sites. And if anyone were to do that, no matter whether they were friend or foe, we would of course call them out on doing that. We of course observe and support international rule of law, which is why we do support Article 51 of the UN, the inherent right of a nation to defend itself. How that nation comes to that decision, to take sometimes those very difficult decisions, is first of all a matter for the nation and the intelligence they have in front of them at the time and evidence. I cannot speak for what the United States had in front of them at the time that they made that decision. That is a matter for the United States law officers and indeed the President of the United States. What I can say of the intelligence that I have seen, there is definitely a case that I would say to answer that there would be cause for self-defence. But that is not me speaking for the United States. That is a matter for the United States, and every single leader has a very difficult challenge. They are the ones responsible for the decisions they make at the time based on the information that is available to them. So I cannot expand further on whether or not the United States, what they made that decision on. However, the inherent right in Article 51 for a nation to defend itself is a right that I know he supports. It is part of international law, and the UK government defends a nation's right to take that action if it is in accordance with Article 51 of the United Nations.
It was disappointing that we were not informed about this attack in advance, but does the Defence Secretary agree that whilst that may be partly because this administration does have the habit of doing a lot of things unilaterally, It is also because of growing scepticism in Washington about European commitment to global security, because of the vast disparity in defence spending between European countries and the United States. And the right place to address this is the Defence and Security Review that is happening this year, which can show that a newly confident post-Brexit Britain takes its defence obligations seriously.
My right honourable friend is right that the Defence and Security and Foreign Policy Review is the place for us to examine our place in the world and what funding goes behind that. When it comes to being informed, every single country, the United Kingdom, the United States, has a category of no foreign eyes, as they call it, no foreign in the United States, UK eyes only in the UK and in other countries around the world. And none of us know what it is like in another country when they have a short notice, potentially, in one case where life is at risk, how much time they have to action that intelligence or threat, and how much time they have to inform their friends and neighbours. It is a real challenge, and in my own experience, where I have had intelligence in front of me as a soldier, you don't always get the luxury of time to inform everybody, even within your own system. And we should remember that it is clear the United States did not inform Congress, let alone its friends and allies at that particular moment. We do not know what it was that was urgent enough for the United States administration to do that. It may well have been threat to life, which is paramount that it is dealt with, is more important at that particular moment in time to that particular decision maker than necessarily telling us. They did, however, tell us very quickly after the event, and we have engaged with them throughout the process.
Sudhi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I met the former Foreign Secretary, the now Prime Minister, he told me and my constituent Richard Radcliffe that he would leave no stone unturned to ensure the release of my constituent Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe. So I was alarmed to hear the present Foreign Secretary Andre Andrew Marshall over the weekend when he seemed to agree with Andrew Marr that there was nothing the government could do to ensure the release of Nazanin Zaghari Radcliffe. So I asked the Minister, which is it? Is the government going to leave no stone unturned to ensure that Nazanin comes home? Or are British prisoners going to be left to rot in jail in Iran while the situation between the US and Iran escalates more and more?
This government will do everything it can to get released from Iranian prisons, not just her constituent, but the very many dual nationals currently languishing in those jails. And as she will know, this has been a long-term foreign policy tool of the Iranian government to incarcerate people it doesn't like or to intimidate nations. Hostage-taking, which to some extent some of these prisoners are certainly, is a tool that has been in the Iranian handbook for many decades. We will do everything we can to try and get her constituent released, Mr. Speaker, and I mean everything we can do to do that. However, we will do everything within international law. That is our only parameter, but we will try and try and try, and my right honourable friend continues to do it almost on a daily basis.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, may I say to my right honourable friend that isn't the issue here at stake that Soleimani and his deputy were responsible already for vast attacks on our allies and on British citizens, leading to the loss of life and to the explosions that we saw in Saudi Arabia quite recently in the oil fields. So surely the point here that we want to make is not just that he may have posed a threat, he has already been a threat. And as a result of his position, Iran's policy has been to escalate all of the conflict across the Middle East. So he's right, surely, to want to de-escalate it, but part of that is to ensure that Soleimani and co. do not no longer exist and can no longer escalate such terrible actions.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to highlight that it is not just the incident of the 2nd of January. It has been the long, consistent destabilising in the region by the Quds Force that has done Iran no favours at all. In fact, it's had the opposite effect. Rather than making Iran powerful and influential, it has made Iran a pariah in its own neighbourhood and has led them down a cul-de-sac to where we find ourselves now, in a place that is potentially very dangerous, and we all need, therefore, to do everything we can to de-escalate, and included in that is to make sure that Iran ceases the destabilising activity that prevents the building of trust by its neighbours, because it is the neighbourhood that may well help find a solution, but they have to trust Iran to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The key question is, where is all this going? Now, Iran has announced, since this happened, that it will not abide by the limits on the use of centrifuges agreed under the Jcpoa. What is the government's assessment of the Jcpoa now? Is it in intensive care or is it dead? And is it the government's policy to resurrect this agreement? And if it is, how does it intend to pursue this objective?
We believe the Jcpoa still has life in it, and with the right amount of effort and focus, both with the E3 and with Iran, and indeed the work we will communicate, which we do communicate to the United States, we believe it is a route that would prove successful. The Jcpoa has a dispute resolution mechanism within it. We have not yet gone to that, but it is one of the areas you can seek to remedy if you are going to try and pull back Iran from potentially the path that may eventually break that Jcpoa. We don't think it's dead. We think there is still a chance, and we will make sure that despite what's going on now in the immediate, in the long term, that is the best solution.
Brother.
In light of Soleimani's alliances with Hezbollah and Hamas, and now the explicit threats of revenge, does he agree that Israel is exposed and faces a real risk of attack from Iran? If he does, what steps is the UK government taking to support Israel, a true friend of the UK and a true friend of democracy, in its right to self-defence?
Well, regretfully, Mr. Speaker, I don't think the threat to Israel will have changed, because even before this death, Iran had been using its proxies to directly and indirectly target Israeli interests, not just in the region, but also around the world. Israel, in its public statements, however, does recognise the threat that General Soleimani posed, but also recognises the importance of finding a solution to this growing sort of tensions. You know, the tensions in this region, Mr. Speaker, help absolutely no one. It doesn't help Iran find a way out. It doesn't help Israel's security. It doesn't help Iraq's security. And that's why we are absolutely determined to see what we can do to try and de-escalate through the diplomatic route, but also find long-term solutions in the hope that both the Jcpoa continue to flourish. But if not that, there is another path for Iran to follow.
Tindoka to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For many global security scholars, there's an incredible number of secondary questions in regards to this act. Indeed, Iraq itself has a close military and political relationship with Washington, as the Secretary of State will know, yet was not consulted, as we've heard, over the assassination of this prominent target in its own sovereign territory. So has the Secretary of State sought assurances from their American counterparts that they will not extend, as the Secretary of State said, doing what they must do to defend themselves via the targeted assassinations on other allies' and sovereign territory, including the United Kingdom?
The honourable gentleman mixes the right of the UN, Article 51, the inherent right to defend yourself from threats against your citizens or elsewhere, with an unchallengeable sovereignty, that you can't in some way, in a part of a country where you are under threat, take action to defend yourself. The way we mostly do it is we get in touch with the other country and have someone arrested or indeed dealt with when there is a direct threat. But that is not always an option, depending on imminence. And as I said in the statement, Mr. Speaker, the number of times the United States and UK coalition forces had been attacked in Iraq in the last few months with no action being taken, and indeed where an American lost their life, had been growing. 14 attacks, 32 rockets in the last one. In the end, a nation, any responsibility is to make that difficult choice about whether the sovereignty, balancing sovereignty, intelligence, and indeed the duty to defend their citizens, they have to make that choice sometimes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has made a proper case for the British government's position so far, but I wonder if he'd go a little bit further forward and talk about the work he's doing to make sure that this doesn't become a cliff edge to war, but instead the low point of a tick that leads to progress, working with allies like Kuwait, Qatar and Oman, perhaps, to reach out to Iran and assure them that we do not wish a conflict. What we wish instead is a change of policy that has led not only to the deaths of Brits, and far too many, but hundreds of thousands of Muslims in Syria and Iraq, and it is for them that we are standing up and for them that we want to change.
My honourable friend is absolutely right to focus on how we can broaden the whole sort of network of diplomatic pressure on both Iran and, in a sense, support for Iraq and indeed the United States and other countries engaged in this area. Iran has remarkable, if I remember rightly, Mr. Speaker, links, used to have links with Japan, for example, and all levers that we can explore, we are exploring. Myself, my colleagues in the Foreign Office and indeed at Number 10, the Prime Minister, are working as broad and as fast as we can to seek a way of using diplomacy and people who have good access into the very heart of the Iranian government to try and reach a place where we can persuade the Iranians that retaliation is not in their best interest, but at the same time offer them a way out so that we can get back to a more stable Middle East.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with much of the Minister's critique of Iran and also of General Soleimani, and I of course support the US's right to self-defence. But to assert that right through international extrajudicial preemptive assassination surely warrants some criticism also, if only to ensure that our diplomacy is effective. Isn't the government's unquestioning support of Trump likely to enhance Iran's influence and control in Iraq, a country where so many of our armed forces have given their lives?
I'm grateful for the honourable lady's comments. Our support of the United States is not unquestioning at all. We talk to our allies a lot. Indeed, I said to my United States counterpart about being told in advance and not being told in advance. I have those discussions. We are friends and allies, but we are also critical friends and allies when it matters. We are also focused on making sure that Iraq, because after all it is Iraq who are on the front line of both Iranian meddling and indeed Daesh attacks on a daily basis, and that is why we are invited into Iraq by the sovereign government, or were at the moment, to try and help build their capacity to help them defend themselves. That is the most important thing for us at the moment in this current moment in time, is the Iraqi people are at great risk at the moment of both Iranian militia antagonism, but also Daesh. And we will be speaking, and we are continually trying to get them to say it is in your best interest for us to remain, but we will respect Iraqi sovereignty. If they require us to leave, that is their right, and we will respect it. It is interesting that no one has yet mentioned in the media, that no one has asked quite why an Iranian general felt that his job was to parole around Iraq, who is, by the way, Iran not invited into Iraq's affairs.
To Liam Fox.
Mr. Speaker, I entirely agree with my right honourable friend. General Soleimani carried out Iran's proxy wars from the horrors in Yemen to the support for the bloody Assad regime. He was a key ally of Hezbollah and its terror networks, and he did all of these as a central figure in the Iranian regime, if not number two in the Iranian regime. I say to my right honourable friend, we need to accept that the Jcpoa has effectively been dead since American withdrawal, and we need to look for a more comprehensive agreement in the broader region if we're to maintain stability in that broader region in the wider global interests.
My honourable friend is absolutely right about the behaviour of the Quds Force, the Revolutionary Guard, over the years. There are plenty of voices in Iran and decent people who seek a way out for the government and the people of Iran to move back to a normal position of international respect, who are trying and have tried. Certainly when we went to visit, they have tried. People trying to get away from the principalists, the hardliners who were running that country into the ground and into a pariah state. Soleimani was one of those people that enabled those hardliners to create this pariah state that they are fast that they find themselves in now. The balance we have to see is how we can make sure that those people seeking the right path are either empowered or heard and are not snuffed out by the revolutionary guard. I fear that in the last 12 months, the upper hand of the Revolutionary Guard under Soleimani and his gang have meant that those moderate voices have been snuffed out to the extent that the Supreme Leader and others are not at the moment interested in finding an alternative. Our job is to persuade them there is an alternative.
What I would say is, could we have short questions and speedy answers, because I'm going to have to cut this off. The House will be sitting very late into the morning, so I have got concerns that I want to get as many people as possible. Jamie Stone.
Mr Speaker, clearly the issue of British nationals living in the area is extremely important. The Secretary of State has touched on this. Can I press the Secretary of State? Will the Secretary of State, has he had discussions with suitable civil airline companies or shipping companies to get our citizens out if, and pray God it never happens, perish the thought, the situation worsens in any way?
My honourable friend, the shipping minister, is having a meeting with the shipping industry tomorrow about effectively, predominantly, I think, protecting the ships in the straits and the vulnerabilities there. We are, both with military planners and civilian planners, in the process of thinking about a whole range of actions that we could do for evacuation, or indeed getting people to a safe neighbouring country if there was anything happen of the worst. So we plan for the worst, but we don't think and hope not that it ever gets that way. But we put all our assets at disposal in order to do that.
Andrew Mitchell.
My right honourable friend is clearly absolutely right to focus laser-like on defending British personnel and British interests. But can he assure the House that Britain is working closely with all our allies in Europe and the region, as well as in the US, to finish the job of defeating ISIL and to de-escalate tensions rather than see them spiral out of control, using all the opportunities available to do this through the much challenged but vitally important international rules-based system?
Yes, my honourable friend is absolutely right that the threat to us in the United Kingdom and to Europe, the number one threat is the actions by Daesh, and we must continue the assault on them, not only in their bases where they are, but also on their ideas on the internet and in some of our own communities. We'll continue to do that. I spoke with my French counterpart, who have often been at the forefront of attacks by ISIS in Europe, and her and I are determined that this does not fall off the agenda and that we maintain both our investment in fighting ISIS but also our determination to recognise that they haven't gone away and that this will be a long fight.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Defence Secretary has rightly spoken about the need for de-escalation and diplomacy. Could I press him on the point that was raised a moment ago? It has been reported that the US administration has denied a visa to the Iranian foreign minister to attend the United Nations, which I would have thought was one of the places we would like that diplomacy to take place. Does he think that that decision helps what he is calling for or hinders it?
Right honourable member asks. Look, we heard the reports like him, and we are trying to establish the truth of it. It came out of Iranian media at the moment. Our position would be we would urge that he is granted a visa. The United Nations is obviously one of those key locations where we will try and use diplomatic levers to resolve and de-escalate the situation.
Julian Lewis.
President Trump has already thrown our Kurdish friends in the area under a metaphorical bus. Can the Secretary of State confirm whether or not this dramatic action that he has taken means that he is turning away from his policy of withdrawing from the region, or he is increasing his policy of withdrawing from the region, or he hasn't got the slightest idea which of the two he ought to do?
I think my right honourable friend is, I can't answer for the United States' long-term policy on the Middle East. What I can say is this was heavily weighted in self-defence, an issue of the here and now and the threat that they faced. But his question feeds quite rightly my honourable friend, the former Foreign Secretary's point, is that actually we need to invest in our defence and security so that we are never over-dependent on one ally or another, because it is the UK government's view that we need to have a long-term support and investment in Iraq. It's important for the region, and we don't want to be in a place where we are always dependent on others, that should they change their policy, our policy has to go with it, whether we want it or not.
Wayne David.
Between, on the one hand, France and Germany, and on the other hand, the United States. Can I ask the Secretary of State what action the government is taking to make sure that once again our international allies and NATO speaks and acts with one voice and one action?
I spoke to my German counterpart yesterday, and indeed the German statement on Friday, which came out before ours, was actually very, very similar. Germany, there isn't a difference between France and Germany. Germany has been very clear about its view on self-defense, and the United States, like us, it is determined to maintain the fight on Daesh, is worried about instability and wants to work hard on de-escalation. France, Germany and Britain are united that the Jcpoa is the way forward, and Chancellor Merkel, I think, is due to visit soon, and we will certainly continue to engage to use that front with the United States to try and get them to support or re-engage the Jcpoa. But at the same time, it is absolutely clear the Germans have forces in Iraq as well, that once this phase passes, we have to get together and really try and work for that stability.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to start by thanking our diplomatic service and the armed forces who have been working tirelessly over the last few days in our defence. Does my right honourable friend agree that the foremost priority of this government is de-escalating the crisis, but beyond that, protecting our armed forces who have been out there and whose senior commanders and outcomes have said are worthwhile collateral damage in attacks against the US?
Mr. Speaker, thank you. And can I welcome my honourable friend to her position in Parliament, and I look forward to working with her. Look, it is absolutely true that the first thing we have to do is, if we really want to protect our people and our friends and allies, is to work hard to de-escalate this situation. We do not want a conflict to spread, and we don't want it to get worse. At the same time, we will use the assets of both the Ministry of Defence and wider government to protect our people, whether they are in theatre or even here at home, from any threats that may be posed by anyone who wants to take a reprisal.
McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State rightly mentioned the actions of the Assad regime in Syria, and he'll be aware of the situation in Idlib. Can I ask him what meetings have gone on amongst himself, the Secretary of State for International Development, and the Home Secretary, making sure that there are sufficient legal routes for refugees from Syria to this country, should they be required?
I haven't had significant meetings, other than I support or facilitate any of those accesses for people who wish to come out, or where we have been involved in trying to evacuate people from any part of the Middle East. Certainly in places like Syria or children, we get involved with. I am very happy to take up for her with the Home Secretary the issue. She's absolutely right, Mr. Speaker. Idlib should not be forgotten. What is going on there right now is a horror show, and we should do all we can to help the people of Idlib, and we shouldn't forget that the regime that is doing it to them is supported and aided by the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and that is a very important point not to forget.
Tobias Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Defence Secretary's statement and the tone in which he's adopted to date. For too long, Soleimani and the Quds Force have been allowed to operate a shadow war across the Middle East. But it's clear from the frequent demonstrations that take part across Iran that the Iranian people do not support their regime and its proxy interference. He focused on the immediate. He focused on managing the heightened threat, on containing expected reprisals and calling for de-escalation. But with the architect of so much instability removed, is there not a rare opportunity to reset our Middle East strategy? Firstly, to be more assertive in tackling proxy interference and weapons proliferation, and secondly, to be more proactive in offering conditional but genuine economic rehabilitation for Iran.
I think my honourable friend is right. I mean, it's certainly brought into sharp focus that the time has run out. We have to sort this in the Middle East collectively, and try and put a long-lasting solution in place. He is also right to make the point that Soleimani's passing does give, in one sense, an opportunity for people to realise that his policy has done nothing but produce Iran as a pariah state. And we shouldn't also forget that the population of Iran, just like the population of Iraq, in my experience, don't want America, don't want Britain, don't want Iran, a regime. They want their own nation. Iraqis are nationalistic, Iranians are nationalistic, and we should never forget when dealing with those countries that if the one thing we can do is give them their country back, we can support their human rights. That is the best way for us to proceed in the West, rather than imposing on them.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that the Iran nuclear deal, recklessly abandoned by President Trump, hangs by a thread, as well as doing everything that he can to help restore it, does the Minister acknowledge that the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference in May will now be even more critical in terms of rebuilding trust? And can he guarantee that the government will play a very serious role at that conference in terms of using it to demonstrate real commitment to multilateral disarmament?
Right Honourable Friend, the Middle East Minister says, absolutely, we will. It's incredibly important to us. I absolutely echo that. It is important, and we will put all the effort in it to try and get a good result.
Robert Halford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the nuclear agreement with Iran, Iran has stepped up its support for terrorism, both in finance and military equipment, in terms of Hezbollah in Syria and Lebanon. What is my right honourable friend doing to contain the Hezbollah threat, not just for Israel, but for the wider region?
My honourable friend will know that a few months ago in this House they prescribed the full element of Hezbollah. The main key is we work with our allies. We strengthen the state of Lebanon so it has some resistance to Hezbollah within its state. We think that is important. Hezbollah have a habit of assassinating people that disagree with it within Lebanon. And at the same time, we work with our ally Israel to make sure that where we have knowledge or where they have knowledge, we can work together to protect them from terrorists.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State is right to call for de-escalation. The consequences of a wider conflict with Iran would be severe, but also because it diverts from those many other crises we see in the region. Idlib's been mentioned, Yemen, and of course I want to ask him specifically about the situation about prisons in northern Syria, which were housing many of the Daesh fighters that pose a risk to ourselves and civilians in northern Syria, and have been effectively, left abandoned because of the consequences of the US actions with regard to our Kurdish allies and Turkey's intervention. What is his assessment of the security of those prisons and the risk posed by the escape of prisoners from them?
At present, ourselves and the French and even in the United States consistently talk with the likes of the SDF to make sure that those prisons are still guarded, and whatever support we can, we are giving to help them do that. Like him, we recognise the importance of it. It has got lots of foreign fighters in it. It's also got lots of more localised fighters. We don't want Daesh to be reborn in those prisons. And that's why it's incredibly important that we would be able to stay in Iraq, because part of how we're going to deal with that is in partnership with the Iraqis, either if they're Iraqi foreign fighters or others. And that's why we urge the Iraqi government to reconsider that vote, because we think it would be very useful to stay to help secure them.
Mr. Speaker, as the Secretary of State says, the British Army has played an absolutely crucial role in training both Iraqi and Kurdish troops, seen with my own eyes. Would you agree with me, therefore, that it's not only essential that we should safeguard our troops in Iraq for their own safety, but that also the whole future of our policy with regard to the Middle East is dependent on our continuing to contain Daesh in Iraq, and the armed forces have an extremely important part to play in doing that?
My honourable friend's absolutely right. Nation building of Iraq is really, really important, not just for us, but for the people of Iraq. We have only suspended the training. We still think it is really, really important to help capacity build the security forces, and that's why it's a suspension, and we have not stopped doing it. And we will seek to restart as soon as we possibly can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It will not be lost on the Defence Secretary that one of the first political organisations to mourn the passing of Soleimani was in fact Republican Sinn Féin, some of whose members may be well known to frontbench members of the opposition as well. Previously, the government had indicated that they were carrying out a review on whether or not to prescribe Muslim Brotherhood. I understand there was Shiite in terms of the organisations involved, but is that still the case? Is there going to be a review into the prescribing of Muslim Brotherhood, and would that help protect the citizens in this country?
My honourable friend points out about Republican Sinn Féin. I noticed the tweet. Bizarre, really, but it shows the long tentacles that in the history Hezbollah or indeed Revolutionary Guard of Iran may have had in his own communities, potentially. The matter of prescription of any organisation is a matter for the Home Office. They will no doubt hear what he has said, and I can get him an answer from them if he wishes.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I very much welcome the Secretary of State's statement on de-escalation. The Secretary of State knows de-escalation could mean many things to many people. If one asked the Syrians or the Iraqis or the Lebanese, they would say de-escalation would be for the Iranian militia not to operate in their sovereign territory. The question I ask the Secretary of State is this: what have the Iranians said their end game is? What do they want to de-escalate the situation? Because the end, it has to be de-escalation and people living side by side in a neighbourly conduct and way.
All my experience of the Iranians are that the Iranians want to be a nation of the world respected and remembered for their culture and their position. That is their end state. The challenge is some of them think the way they get there is in a way that has delivered this type of pariah status for them. And we need to point out that the rule of law, they have a bizarre, a very good constitution that they seek to avoid half the time, but the way for them to enter into the world of civilised nations again is to actually behave like one. And that's what we are there to help with, that's what we're there to support, and there are many people in the country who know exactly that. Lind.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister does recognise how the safer and more pluralistic Kurdistan region can play a really positive role in the wider efforts to de-escalate the conflict, but it does need stronger assurances about its own security and continuing UK efforts so it can remain respected and neutral as a player in this situation. So does he now think it's time to implement the promise made to invite the leadership of the KRG to the UK on its official visit?
I think what is important is that the Kurds and indeed some of them are sectarian groups or ethnic groups in the area understand about security. It is often insecurity that has driven many of these conflicts for dozens of years. Iran feels desperately insecure often in its region. The Kurds have often felt insecure because of the history of many nations, including Iran, who have set about them. And so the first thing we should all do is seek to find security guarantees for many of these people, and that way can then start the next process of resolving the problems between the different parts of the Middle East.
My right honourable friend's statement and the personal authority and experience he brings to this issue. Will he work with all our coalition allies to sustain our commitment to all the people of Iraq, most of whom would not welcome us, abandoning them to the forces, both heretical and now corrupt, not least in the Iranian Republican Guard Corps, behind the Iranian Revolution?
My honourable friend and I visited Iran as well, I think, a long time ago. And I think, Mr. Speaker, he speaks a lot of sense that Britain's focus has to be about how we can continue over the long term supporting Iraq and their people. It is a complex country with many different groups, and it is those differences that have been exploited recently by Iranian-backed militia that, again, has, instead of helping those people, has actually led to misery. And we must do what we can to capacity build the Iraqi state so they can make decisions for themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, many of us have great concerns about the repercussions of this event, and that rather than de-escalating the situation, we see, in fact, the opposite happening. So, can I ask the Secretary of State, in whatever discussions he has with his US counterparts, if he manages to have any influence with them, he can state very clearly that we do not support this method of taking out our enemies. and in fact that winning the battle of hearts and minds has far much more effect on a long term than this.
I certainly press on the United States, who have also said that it is not in their interest or their wish to increase tensions. They do not want this event to lead to war. They have been very, very clear about that, as have indeed the Iranian leadership. And if we accept that both the Iranian and the United States have been adamant they do not want a war, we should then work on that as a way to get both sides to seek a resolution.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Very few countries' hands are completely clean in the region, and a key part of the problem is that there has been a lack of a coordinated, overarching peace process, particularly now the Iranian nuclear deal is dead. Does he agree that from our point of view, the elephant in the room is that we need to spend more on our defence and diplomacy, raise that expenditure, in order not just to send a very clear signal to the world that we are going to better defend and our interests if we need to, but also to hold greater sway with our key allies, particularly the US, in this particular region?
My right honourable friend makes the really important point that both diplomacy and defence don't come cheap, and we need to invest in that. And sometimes we need to invest in helping others defend themselves as well. I think it's one of the most noble things to defend those that cannot defend themselves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the steps that the Secretary of State has outlined to de-escalate tensions? But if that was to fail and Iran did attack and retaliate, and that results in the deaths of British service personnel and indeed civilians, what would be our response?
Well, if British civilians were killed, or even military personnel, as a result of Iranian or terrorist action, we would look at the response. The response would no doubt be proportionate, and we will, of course, look at it at the time of it happening.
My honourable friend has already mentioned the 14 attacks which have happened since October in Baghdad. But is he aware that the US Department of Defence have estimated that over 600 servicemen have been killed by Iran or their proxies? What estimate has my right honourable friend made of the number of British servicemen who have been killed? And does he not agree with me that when there is an imbalance and people defend either the actions of Iran or attack the United States, it simply gives comfort to Tehran?
My honourable friend makes a point about the deaths of the United States personnel, and we should not forget, and we should pay tribute to the 179 UK defence personnel who died in operations in Iraq and the 454 who died in operations in Afghanistan. He will remember, like me, that many of the tragic deaths in Iraq of UK personnel happened in Basra, where the Shia militia were supported and instigated by members of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard.
Sir Edward Day. Can I thank the Minister for his statement, and in particular his emphasis on de-escalating tension, and can I acknowledge his genuine expertise on Iran? Given how damaging the Iraq war was to security in the Middle East, and given the government's support for reducing tension, will the Secretary of State now rule out any British involvement in any attack on any site in Iran?
I'm not going to rule out anything. The UK will do what it has to do to defend its persons, its citizens, and wherever it needs to do that. That is our duty. We cannot say what is in the minds of Iran or anybody else in the future, and that's why we will always reserve our right to take that decision at the time of it.
Alex Shelbrooke. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, events like this have an immediate impact on all our constituents, and my constituent Velma and Rothwell will be noticing the oil price rising, concerns on the budgets of their household. And of course, that brings us right back to the Straits of Hormuz. Now, NATO for the last 70 years has had a policy of deterrent working as prevention. So could I ask my right honourable friend, will he meet with his counterparts in our NATO allies to discuss the possibility of using NATO resources in maritime to put protection forces in place that actually would act as a deterrent rather than having to react to any activity that may take place?
My honourable friend makes a really good suggestion. I will take it up at the NATO Defence Ministers meeting for him, and he is right. And we already have a number of international coalitions in the Straits, the anti-piracy, which I think even involves China, and a number of the IMSC, the International Maritime Security concept that we are with the Americans on protecting our tankers. He is right. Tanker wars, as it was called in the 1980s, has been around for a long time. The Iranians used to fire RPGs at tankers back then, deliberately to spike the oil price, and I think his suggestion is well heard.
Since the assassination, as a part of its military build-up, the US has deployed its long-range bombers to Diego Garcia, territory, of course, which the British state illegally occupies. Whilst he talks about de-escalation, isn't it the reality that the British government's actions are actually helping to escalate the crisis?
No, I think the United States have said it's deployed many of its troops in response to the rhetoric coming out of Iran to make sure it protects its forces. And of course, that is the right thing to do. We have sent a small team to make sure that our military planners are properly enabled, and indeed we have changed the posture of our forces in Iraq to make sure they are currently focusing on their force protection. That does not mean we are preparing to do anything else, and nor does it mean the United States are.
Matthew Offord. In the last 6 months alone, Iran has disregarded 4 tenets of the Jcpoa. In addition to that, Iran has refused to answer questions from the IAEA about uranium particles found at a previously undisclosed location at Badaya. In addition to that, we should not forget that the Jcpoa allowed millions of pounds in addition to manpower and resources to pour into Syria to continue that war and kill thousands of people. Does the Secretary of State agree with me that it's simply incorrect for anyone to say that the Jcpoa is alive and well?
I didn't say it was sort of alive and well and all business as normal. I said it wasn't dead. The Jcpoa is a deal that I believe was the right thing to do. I remember even before it was formed, myself and the leader of the opposition even would urge the Bush administration to talk to the Iranians, to engage and seek a way through, and we came to an Iranian deal that we thought was correctly monitored, that the European powers thought was a good way through. And indeed, but he is right, the Iranians, not just the United States who withdrew, the Iranians have tested that to every single inch of the written agreement. That doesn't detract from the fact we believe the Jcpoa is the right way forward, and we will invest our time and effort in trying to make sure it has a future.
Debbie Abraham.
I welcome what the Minister, the Secretary of State for Defence said in terms of the de-escalation actions that both his ministers and his officials will be doing in relation to Iran. But the response to my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, suggests that he was taken by surprise about the actions that the US have just taken in declining to give a visa to the Iranian foreign minister. So what actions is his administration doing to ensure that the US, but also the UN, play a full role in helping to de-escalate these events?
My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, is visiting the United States later this week, and within that will be our determination to try and seek a diplomatic way out through that. He will no doubt have discussions with his counterparts, and we will see where we can get to. I haven't been, the United States doesn't share its visa decisions on a live wire with us. However, we just saw earlier reports, I think as many members here have done. We will find out and get to the bottom of it, and certainly my urging from the dispatch box on behalf of the government is we think actually allowing Iranian Mr. Zarif to the UN would of course be a sensible thing to do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Defence Secretary has mentioned on numerous occasions in his statement about the importance of our diplomatic network in de-escalating this crisis. Would he agree with me that the position of UK Ambassador to Washington has actually now been vacant for far too long, and would he encourage the Foreign Secretary to make that appointment?
My right honourable friend, with an excellent record of Foreign Office Minister, I will ask the Prime Minister at the NSC next.
Tommy Shepherd.
Are there any other members or officials of the Iranian government whose assassination the United Kingdom would find acceptable?
I mean, I don't know how to start, Mr. Speaker, on that question. I think the United Kingdom would always seek to follow international law in dealing with threats against it. And within that international law ranges all the options from arrest, detention, disruption. But in some occasions, as we see when we have seen, for example, events in Syria take place, there is an occasion where, unfortunately, kinetic or lethal strike has been engaged. The RAF, the British government, have been very open about that, followed a vote in Parliament. We will always reserve in this country the right for us to defend ourselves against threats posed to our citizens. And I don't think the First Minister of Scotland would disagree with that at all.
Mr. Speaker, with hardline voices currently drowning out moderate voices in Iran, what confidence can this House have that the President of the United States is alert to the Pandora's box that he has potentially opened? And what can the international civilised community do to articulate what it is to be a moderate country and to give succour, support and encouragement to those moderate voices in Iran to remain moderate and to remain speaking out?
I think the best way we can empower the moderate voice of Iran is to offer them the hand of friendship to a way out, to offer them to say this is not about a war, we do not want a war, we do not want the conflict to increase, we want to be clear about what behaviour we think should change and also be prepared to deal in other parts to make sure we try and get them in a better place. I think that is the best solution for Iran. The moderates know that. Let's hope they can hear it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Jcpoa has been mentioned several times this afternoon. Could the Secretary of State confirm that it's the UK Government's position that there's no immediate grounds to trigger the dispute mechanism in that agreement?
The Government will consider all options as it sees the latest announcements of Iran and indeed in its discussions with people like the IEA as well.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Years ago, I was pleased to visit HMS Jafar in Bahrain. What additional Royal Navy support is going to be deployed to the Gulf to ensure the safety and security of British shipping and interests?
We have at the moment in the Gulf region HMS Defender, HMS Montrose, a Type 45 and a Type 23 frigate. We have a Royal Fleet auxiliary ship with helicopter support. We have a number of mine sweepers. We have quite a lot of Navy assets in that region, as do our allies, and indeed as do the other Gulf Arab states in that area. We work together, we coordinate together, we meet in coordination meetings to try and make sure we maximise the use. We're currently focused on making sure that we do not provoke on the Iranian coastline, but at the same time that we maintain the international law of the freedom of navigation so that those ships vital to our economy are not intimidated or kidnapped.
It is unwise to threaten it once. It is deeply alarming to threaten it twice. But if US President Trump does indeed intend to target Iranian cultural sites, can the Minister tell us what the UK response will be and to what extent it will be influenced by the UK government seeking a trade deal with the US?
Well, we've been very, very clear that we will seek anyone who complies with the international law, and targeting heritage sites is against international law, and we will not be shy of calling that out publicly or privately to the United States. As I said after that statement by the President, the United States Defence Secretary made it very clear that the US policy was not to target heritage sites.
Mark up.
Mr. Speaker, one of the reasons the US pulled out of the Jcpoa was the fact that it wasn't comprehensive in the sense that it didn't cover all of the other terrorist actions that were being taken place, including those carried out by General Soleimani. Does the Secretary of State think that one of the ways of kick-starting and using what has happened as a diplomatic opportunity for peace is to try and widen the JCPOA's remit to cover all of those other actions rather than just being focused on the nuclear arrangements, important though they are.
My right honourable friend talks a lot of sense, and indeed that reflects what both sides used to want. In the early 2006, the Iranians made what was called the Grand Bargain, which was a whole offer, including, if memory serves right, the recognition of Israel, funnily enough, and including the abandonment of any nuclear programme. Both sides seem to want a grand offer. Both sides want to see a grand deal. I think it is our duty to try and get them to the table to offer that grand deal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could I press upon the Minister the importance of our UK citizens and residents who are based in prisons in Evian, in the case of my constituent, who remains an employee of the British Council? When was the last time that a ministerial intervention led to the improvement of welfare of any of those prisoners, or led to the hope that they will be returned, in this case, to Crouch End in London?
I can get the honourable friend the exact detail of when. Look, all the time we are visiting or trying to visit with interlocutors those individuals held in those prisons. And as you rightly say, it is not just one individual. There is a whole group of many nations, not just British Iranian nationals, but also European, American, etc., held there. It is part of a deliberate policy, and the individuals in the judiciary in Iran that have been appointed most recently are a worrying sign about what is the intention at the moment of the Iranian regime for the carrying on this policy. We have to change that policy, and in the meantime we have to be absolutely alert to the health and well-being of those people in there, and we will try, not just only with our own embassy staff, but also with other third countries about what help they can give to increase pressure within Iran, but also to make sure we support those prisoners.
Tim Martin.
Mr. Speaker, protecting and promoting culture is a key way of stabilising countries and forging bonds between nations. And to that end, the government's support of the British Museum scheme, training archaeologists to go back and restore those sites so desecrated by Daesh, is a real win-win situation. And in 2017, the UN Security Council voted, including America, to condemn those acts against UNESCO World Heritage Sites. So would the Secretary of State agree that if the US President has now decided unilaterally to reverse that policy, it's not only remarkably stupid, but it's counterproductive as well?
Look, my honourable friend makes the point about the crime that it would be to attack heritage sites. I have made it quite clear that the US policy is not to target those sites. It's been clarified by the US Defence Secretary, and we will make sure that we are very clear in our opposition to targeting of heritage sites anywhere in the world, not just in the Middle East. They are part of our heritage and our history.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I also thank the Secretary of State for his statement today. Iran is no longer a place of cultural, historical and human rights diversity. Under General Soleimani and the Quds Force of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps and their involvement with terrorist groups across the world, Iran has the blood of thousands of innocents on their hands. Iran has said that they will continue to pursue nuclear power. Iran has also stated that they will not rest until Israel is destroyed. So what steps is the Secretary of State taking to provide help and support for Israel in light of the threat from Iran against their so-called enemy? And further, will he publicly state again that this great nation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland stands alongside Israel at all times?
We support Israel. We support their right to defend themselves and their right to exist, and we will work alongside them to make sure that their security is protected. We also will work alongside anyone in the Middle East who seeks to establish better stability and security for their people, but also to make sure that we resolve this current growing conflict.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is obviously vital for global security that Iran does not achieve ownership of nuclear weapons. And so can I thank the Secretary of State for his work with France and Germany to reboot the JCPOA. But given that it is now coming up for 2 years since the US pulled out, if this is not achieved, what is the plan B?
Well, I think we are going to be working hard to make sure it is achieved. The United States President has talked about a grand deal. He has talked about a bigger, more sustainable, long-term deal. He's talked about wanting to do a broader deal. We will, of course, assist in that process if they continue on that path, and we will reach out to the Iranians. Now, we have no ill towards the Iranian people, and we shouldn't forget that this government is concerned and saddened by the loss of up to 50 people in the stampede at the funeral that took place. We send our condolences to those mourners and indeed that population. No one should have to go through that. And our hand of friendship is there for the people of Iran. But if all of this teaches us something, Mr. Speaker, it is that the destabilisation, the leadership of Iran has not served their people well. It has led them down a cul-de-sac, and it has led the Middle East to a less stable, not more stable position.
Final question, Owen Thompson.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. Clearly, any escalation in tensions in the region could have significant consequences for our armed forces, but also the civilian populations there. So it's time for cool heads. The Commander-in-Chief in the States is not known to be a cool head. So what actions can the government take to ensure that late-night Twitter tirades do not further escalate tensions in the region?
Hear, hear. Hear, hear. Many of us should take tips about Twitter. I think the main thing is that this was in response in the United States to a specific threat that they took an action. He can disagree whether they should have done that or not. After this action that has taken place, it is a duty on all of us, and I know that the White House and the US administration are also on the same page, that that single event does not lead to an escalation, and they are keen also to de-escalate it. The challenge for this government, for the Germans, the French and our allies, is to make sure we convert those wishes of not wanting to escalate into action, and that's what we're going to be doing over the next days and weeks.
Can I just say to those members who didn't get called, we've got a list of the ones that wasn't, and I would expect them to be taken very early in the next statement or next questions. A point of order, Sir Bernard.
I apologise for raising what is a complicated matter, but I hope you have been given forewarning that this might be raised. It concerns the election tomorrow of the Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means and the other Deputy Speakers. I think there is a deal of confusion about how the voting system works. It is extremely complicated because we are electing 4 posts, but with restrictions that there must be 1 woman, there must be 1 member of the opposition, and 2 must come from the government side, and 1 will be Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means. And can he clarify, therefore, that a voter's first preferences may be counted even if that voter's first preference choice is elected and may affect the outcome of the election of the Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means?
I'm amazed that you didn't raise in 2010 when I stood. And you've managed to cope with the system all this time. What I would say is that you've managed to accept the system till now, and suddenly to be raised at the last minute, I find quite strange for the House. The House has been aware of the voting system. The House has accepted this voting system. What I would say is I think it's slightly premature, because at 6 o'clock we will know how the system will work and whether one candidate is automatically elected, and that being a woman, and I'm not sure. So what I would say is I think it might be better if we waited till 6 to see what the system throws up, because the answer will be different depending on what happens. But I would reassure the House that I wasn't impressed with this system in 2010. The House has had many chances in which to change it. And what I would say is, if members are unhappy, it is up to the House to change that system. Please do so, because I genuinely think back in 2010 it wasn't the best. And if you're still telling me it's not good now, I think there is a way to do it. But I do find it strange that we voted all this time till now to raise it. Further to that point of order, Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Mr. Speaker, assuming that there is an election tomorrow, could you inform the House of 2 things? Could you firstly inform the House that everybody will only be required to vote once and that their vote will be ranked? And secondly, could you tell the House what arrangements in terms of time and place you have made for the election to take place tomorrow?
First of all, Standing Order number 2A sets out the rules on the election of deputy speakers. Secret ballot, candidates in alphabetical order, vote for as many or as few candidates on the ballot paper as a member wishes, marking them in order of preference. Ballots counted under single transferable vote. Nominations close at 6 p.m. this afternoon, so we will know the list that may help. See paragraph 10 of the briefing notes. Members each have one vote, which is transferable. The wording will be on the ballot paper and an explanation of that. What time it will be declared will depend on the count and how quickly, but obviously there's other business that will defer the announcement of it. My understanding is that the vote takes place between 10 and 1:30, in which I stated earlier, by the way, I have pointed out what time the ballot is on. Hopefully that is helpful to members and that we can move on as we have a long night ahead. Point to order, Mr. Chris Bryan.
It's about elections, but not those elections, I'm afraid. As you will know, Mr. Speaker, the new government members were appointed on the 24th of July last year. Many of them have yet to face a select committee grilling, including the Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Foreign Secretary. The Leader of the House's office at the moment is telling the press that it is unlikely that select committees will be in place before Easter. That would mean that those ministers would have ruled this country for 9 months without ever facing a grilling from a select committee. Is there anything in your power, Mr. Speaker, that you can do to make sure that this process is expedited so that the proper duties of scrutiny can be done by this House?
Well, I would say I'd like to think that a conversation will take place between usual channels, and anything I can help to ensure that we get committees up and running. I think it's better for the House. It also gives members a real interest to get their teeth stuck in to holding the government to account and to making sure that select committees are effective. But I would say, I hear from one voice that says I've done 2 already. So just to say, some may not have, but others have certainly carried out their duties. Right. I now call on the clerk now to proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, Committee.
Hello. Order! Thanks very much. All the best.
Good afternoon, Mr. Rob.
Are we ready?
We absolutely are.
I've got.
Just say order and I'll jump up.
Order.
European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before we commence, as this is the first committee of the whole House of a new Parliament, I thought it might be for the benefit of those who are not entirely familiar with the arcane process, and indeed for the benefit of those who thought they were but aren't, if we sought to explain how this proceeds. You will find on the order paper that the amendments are grouped. You will find that helpfully they're not grouped in sequence, they're grouped by subject. The Chair will try to confine the debate to the subject matter without being too rigorous in exercising control. Ordinarily, the groups will contain a debate, which I will move the first part of, and then the Secretary of State or the Minister will respond to the debate. Exceptionally, because this is the first day of a 2-day debate with a plethora of amendments, I've deemed it helpful if I invite in a moment the Secretary of State to open the debate, to set out the stall. And on that basis, of course, if the opposition front bench wishes to come in immediately following that, that will also be entirely acceptable. The final point that I need to make, I think, is that while any member has a right to speak in this House, it is not, Mr. Speaker has decided, desirable for new members to make maiden speeches in the course of a committee, for 2 reasons. One, it will simply delay the process. And second, and much more important from the point of view of those new members, inevitably their freedom of movement to describe their constituencies as the second Garden of Eden will be limited. And I'm advised that there will be an opportunity to participate, first of all, in the third reading of the bill on Thursday, which will, of course, then have the Speaker in the chair, and then subsequently during the remaining debate on the Queen's speech. I hope that's all clear and helpful. With that in mind, we move straight to Clause 1, Stand Part, with which it will be convenient to take Clauses 2 to 6 Stand Part, a new Clause 4, new Clause 36, and Clause 33 Stand Part. Mr. Secretary Berkeley.
And Mr. Deputy Speaker, may I begin by wishing a Happy New Year to you and indeed to all members of the House. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this bill implements the withdrawal agreement negotiated by the Prime Minister. It fulfils the will of the British people and will set the stage for our bright future outside of the European Union. It lets us take back control of our laws, our money, our borders and our trade policy. This bill delivers on the overwhelming mandate given to us by the British people to get Brexit done by the end of January. Mr. Deputy Speaker, as you just informed the House, at your guidance, I'm speaking at the opening of this grouping and will speak to clauses 1 to 6, clause 33, new clause 4 and 35, noting that new clause 19 and amendment 25 have not been selected. Turning to clause 1, this clause gives legal effect to the implementation period in domestic law. The implementation period ensures that common rules will remain in place until the end of this year, meaning businesses will be able to trade on the same terms as now until a future relationship has been agreed. This provides certainty and stability for the duration of this time. During the implementation period, the effect of the European Communities Act 1972 will be saved and modified on a temporary basis to provide the necessary continuity. I will in a moment. It will have a new purpose, to give effect to EU law as set out in the withdrawal agreement to provide for the implementation period. And as a result, businesses and citizens only need to prepare for one set of changes as we move to our future relationship with the EU. Of course, I give way to my...
Grateful to my right honourable friend. Can you give the House an estimate of how much this implementation period is going to cost us? And will you reassure us that once we're out properly at the end of this year, there won't be future payments thereafter?
Well, it's clear what this is doing is securing our membership for the period, because one of the costs for businesses, one of the greater costs would be is if we had two sets of changes for businesses, if they didn't have the comfort of an implementation period. And it is, and I know my right honourable friend is a great champion of the business community, it is the business community themselves that said that they wanted an implementation period whilst the negotiation on the trade deal was conducted in order to avoid the higher cost in terms of two sets of changing. So this saving, I will in a moment, this saving of the ECA will be repealed at the end of the implementation period, at which point the repurposed ECA will cease to have effect. This clause is essential to achieving the terms agreed in the withdrawal agreement and ensuring the proper functioning of the European Union law during the implementation period. It is for that reason it must stand part of the bill. Of course, I give way to the Honourable.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, but I still don't think he's made a clear enough case about why he would wish to basically tie the hands of the government in such an unnecessary way and risk both the disaster of no deal, but also just the fact that there could be perfectly constructive negotiations going ahead, which he would be prepared to throw away if they can't fit into the arbitrarily short time of 11 months. So can he say again why he thinks that's worth running that risk? Because it is a risk, a big risk for our businesses and for our economy.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I know we've got 2 days of committee, but it is a very odd intervention from someone who wants us to remain as a member of the European Union to complain that we have an implementation period in order that we don't have two sets of changes facing the business community, and we give that confidence to businesses for the rest of this year. Mr Deputy Speaker, moving on to Clause 2. This saves EU-derived domestic legislation for the implementation period. The last 4.5 decades have seen a substantial amount of EU legislation that has required domestic legislation, both primary and secondary. This domestic legislation constitutes a large body of law, and to ensure that this law continues to work properly during the implementation period, we need to take several important steps. First, we must preserve the legislation to avoid it being impliedly repealed following the repeal of the ECA in 1972. If we do not save this legislation, there is a risk that it would either fall away or be emptied of meaning. This could mean that citizens and businesses would no longer be protected by, or indeed able to rely upon, existing rules. The second essential purpose of this clause is to maintain the proper functioning of the statute book for the duration of the implementation period. During the implementation period, we will continue to apply this law, but we will not be part of the European Union. To ensure that this is reflected in our statute books, the bill provides for time-limited glosses or modifications to new and existing EU-derived legislation. These glosses make clear the way that EU law terms and UK legislation should be read, so that our laws continue to work during the implementation period. To take one example, Mr Deputy Speaker, all references to European Union citizens in the UK statute book will, as a general rule, be read as including UK nationals during the implementation period. These provisions will automatically be repealed at the end of this year when they are no longer needed. Of course I go on.
I'm very grateful. I hope you can just clarify whether that also applies to the European arrest warrant, because obviously we will be remaining subject to the European arrest warrant and able to take advantage of it through the implementation period, but at the end of that period, as a third party, we will simply not be able to enter into it. But during this period, will British subjects still be subject to the European arrest warrant overseas?
So, relating firstly to Clause 1, the implementation period ensures continuity of the law. That is why it is saved but modified. In terms of this clause and this grouping, what it is doing is the technical terminology. Where there is a change in meaning, it means continuity. So the substance, I see in front of this substance is yes, in terms of it ensures continuity. But what it does is allow where there's terms where their purpose, such as, for example, a European Union citizen, where we will have actually ceased through our position, we will have left. But on the other hand, the implementation in EU law will continue. So it allows those terms to continue to be applied and any tidying up, any technical changes to be applied. So it's a technical glossing, and that is what its purpose is there. Of course, I can wait to know.
I thank the Secretary of State for giving way. And could he set out, while he's on his feet discussing this, could he set out the exact position for EU nationals? Because those of us who have up to 42,000 living locally are extremely concerned. There's been lots of discussions, tweets and that. Could he please just lay out exactly now what's the position both during the next 12 months implementation plan, but also going forward?
Well, the Honourable Lady raises a very important point, and of course, Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't want to stray too far into the second groupings within committee stage, which is indeed on citizen rights, which my right honourable friend, the Immigration Minister, will address. But what this bill is doing is securing the rights of EU citizens within the UK and indeed the rights of UK citizens in the European Union, because we value the contribution that those EU citizens make to the UK. They've chosen to make their homes here, to bring up their families here, and their rights are protected, and that is one of the reasons why I urge members on all sides of the House to support this bill. I know my right honourable friend.
To my right honourable friend, of course, during the transitional period, there will be laws made in the European Union which we will be expected to obey. However, does my right honourable friend agree that the two clauses, namely 29 and 38, one of which deals with review of legislation through the auspices of the European Scrutiny Committee, where we will be affected by our vital national interests being undermined, provides good protection for the United Kingdom's national interests, and secondly, that the question of parliamentary sovereignty in clause 38 will complement that by ensuring that the whole process of legislation will not affect, under the withdrawal agreement, the continuing sovereignty of the United Kingdom Parliament, which is effectively, therefore, a double lock on the rights of this House as we leave the European Union.
Well, my right honourable friend is absolutely right in terms of signposting two safeguards that are in place, on which he played a significant part. But I would actually say there are three, and I come on to the third, if I may slightly push him in terms of that correction. So the two are, firstly, he's right that the European Committee will have the right to trigger debates and scrutiny through his chairmanship of that select committee. And secondly, again, a clause he, I know, has championed in terms of the sovereignty of Parliament, which is set out very clearly on the face of the bill. The third that I would just draw my right honourable friend's attention to, which is indeed within this grouping, is legislating for the manifesto commitment that the government has given not to extend. And therefore what that does is shorten or ensure that there is no extension, rather, of the implementation period, and therefore it ensures that there is no risk of a 1 or 2 year further period during which the issue to which he was concerned with those two other clauses could arise. So there are three protections, I would say, not just the two. That he, and I'm pleased from a sedentary position, Mr Deputy Speaker, that my right honourable friend signals his consent with that. So ultimately this clause makes sure, ultimately this clause makes sure that there is continuity in our laws during the implementation period, and it makes sure that our law continues to operate properly. It is therefore essential and must stand part of the bill, but of course I'll give way to the honourable lady.
I'm grateful, just in relation to his previous comment about the sovereignty of this United Kingdom Parliament across the whole of the United Kingdom, because of course at all stages in the future, as marked out by the Northern Ireland Protocol and the exception to this bill, people of Northern Ireland will be subject to the Union law as far as we can see for a very long time into the future. So it isn't correct, is it, that the entire of the United Kingdom sovereignty will be placed in this place?
Well, we will debate at length tomorrow the provisions relating specifically to Northern Ireland, but there is a further sovereignty within the bill in respect of Northern Ireland. I don't want to stray too far into the debate tomorrow, but in terms of the consent mechanism that there is pertaining to the Northern Ireland Protocol specifically. So there is a further sovereignty lock in that regard, but that is for the groupings that we will address tomorrow. Mr Deputy Speaker, turning to Clause 3, we are confident that this list of so-called glosses set out in Clause 2 work in all the cases that we have examined. We have indeed, and I pay tribute to officials who have trawled the statute book in this regard. However, as a responsible government, it is right that we reserve the ability to nuance the impact of these technical changes should unforeseen issues arise during the implementation period. The power set out in this clause, I will in a moment, the power set out in this clause provides for this. The bill gives 5 different applications for the power, 3 that relate to the glosses, and let me explain those. The power can add to the glosses, it can make exceptions, and it can be used to make different provisions from that list if for any reason we need to change a gloss in a specific case or set of cases. And the power has 2 further applications. It can also be used to tidy up the European Union Act 2018, and the final use of this power is to cover any specific technical inoperabilities that may occur that have not indeed been foreseen. And so it's appropriate, prudent and sensible that the government is prepared in this regard, and that is why those 5 elements are within the bill. I give way to
them. Very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. Independent analysis by the Scottish Parliament Information Centre, which is the equivalent of the House of Commons Library and therefore independent, notes that this clause 3 empowers UK government ministers acting alone to make provision in devolved policy areas. Now, the government's delegated powers memorandum states that they won't normally do so without the agreement of the relevant devolved administration, but the Secretary of State will be aware that the Sewell Convention doesn't apply to delegated legislation. So can he explain, or will he agree with me, that this power shows that the bill is indeed the power grab which the Scottish National Party have always said it is? And if it isn't, why is this power there at all?
Well, firstly, the Right Honourable Lady is incorrect in saying that. Firstly, this is an international agreement, which is a reserved matter. It is a matter for the United Kingdom. Secondly, these are glosses, these are technical issues in terms of the tidying gap that I set out, and they're tightly defined. And thirdly, in terms of the devolved elements, those are addressed indeed by giving the devolved assemblies the power through Clause 4 for themselves to do further glosses. Of course I go on.
I'm sorry, the Secretary of State's simply wrong about that. It's quite clear that on any legal analysis of Clause 3 that it gives UK ministers the power, acting alone, to make regulations in relation to areas of devolved competence. Now, I reiterate my question. Why is that power there at all if the government is not intending to use it to take powers away from the Scottish Government, Scottish Parliament, not the Scottish Government, the Scottish Parliament, and indeed other devolved administrations?
Because again, with great respect to the Right Honourable Learned Lady, she is overreaching in the interpretation that she is applying to Clause 3. This is a technical provision which allows for technical changes, glosses to terminology, such as the example that I gave the House a moment ago in terms of EU citizens and how that may be defined. And it's for those technical changes on unforeseen areas rather than to fundamental changes of powers. And indeed it is an equivalent power that we have given, and I'll come on to Clause 4, it's an equivalent power that we have given through Clause 4 in respect of the ability of the devolved authorities to do exactly the same thing or very similar. There is a minister, I'll give way a further moment, but Clause 3 must stand part of the bill in order to ensure that the statute book is maintained and any unforeseen technical issues that should arise are addressed in the future. That is why Clause 3 is required. It is not, as the Honourable Lady characterises it, it is a technical provision for glosses for any areas that were unforeseen at the time of the passage of the bill. Of course, I give you.
He's being very generous. If I could just probe that a bit further. Clause 4(11)(b) makes specific provision that the Scottish Government and indeed Welsh Government ministers couldn't make any provision out with devolved competence. So the Scottish Government ministers couldn't use their powers to make provisions out with devolved competence. That's specifically provided for here. But there's no equivalent provision in Clause 3 saying that the British Government couldn't use these powers to make regulations about devolved matters. Now, if the Minister says this is just technical, why won't he agree to including a similar qualification in relation to the British Government's powers? Or might he do so, and could that perhaps be addressed in the Lords?
Mr. Representative, no, it can't be. It is not something that I would urge the other place to address, because this is about having a provision to address unforeseen areas where technical changes may be required in the very tightly constrained areas that are set out in Clause 3. And the Right Honourable Lady turns to Clause 4, and is right, Mr Deputy Speaker, that we now draw the House's attention to doing so. And Clause 4 confers on the devolved authorities a broadly equivalent power, indeed, to that set out in Clause 3. And it is right that where legislating for the implementation period falls within the devolved competencies, the legislative changes can be made by the devolved authorities. And on that, I'm sure the Right Honourable and Learned Lady would agree with me. Therefore, this change provides in Clause 4 that the devolved authorities with corresponding powers to those which are set out in Section 8A, 8A1, A, B, C and E, so far as they are exercised within the devolved authority's competence. And this clause enables devolved authorities to add to the list of glosses established at Section 1B, to make a different provision to that list, and to disapply that list from certain pieces of legislation. The clause also enables devolved authorities to respond to unforeseen complications that may arise during the implementation period, to ensure the provisions established by this bill continue to give effect to the implementation period. In short, Mr Deputy Speaker, the rationale for this Clause 4 is indeed the same as the rationale for Clause 3. When exercised by a devolved authority acting alone, their power is indeed subject to consent of a Minister of the Crown, consultation with the Minister of the Crown, or is subject to a joint exercise with the Minister of the Crown in certain circumstances, and those, as Right Honourable Lady will be aware, are defined in paragraphs 5 to 7 of Schedule 2 of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018. The implementation period is critical. It will provide much needed continuity and certainty to businesses and individuals as we move from membership to our future relationship with the EU. With the power provided in this clause, the devolved authorities can ensure the implementation period will work in relation to devolved legislation should any issues be identified. Therefore, this clause must stand part of the bill. Moving, Mr Deputy Speaker, to clause 5. This provides for direct application of provisions of the withdrawal agreement in domestic law. It will also allow individuals and businesses to rely directly on the withdrawal agreement. They will be able to know that there is a consistency in the way in which the agreement is applied in both the UK and the EU. It is necessary to give domestic legal effect to Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement. Through this clause, most of the provisions of the agreement will flow into UK law directly, without the need for further legislation to implement it. The withdrawal agreement will, among other things, secure the rights of more than 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and around 1 million UK nationals living in the EU. Making sure that the withdrawal agreement is interpreted and enforced consistently in both the UK and the EU will ensure that these citizens are treated fairly and equally. This clause, in its presented form, is vital to the UK's implementation of the withdrawal agreement, and it must therefore, Mr Deputy Speaker, stand part of the bill. Turning to clause 6, the UK has reached agreements with the EA EFTA states and with Switzerland, respectively. These agreements are separate, although similar to our agreements with the EU. They protect the rights of Norwegian, Icelandic, Liechtenstein and Swiss citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in those countries, so that they can continue to live their lives broadly as they do now after exit day. Of course, I give way to them.
I thank the Secretary of State for accepting a further intervention. Could he explain in very clear language how he believes this will be played out at airports? Are there going to be several queues? Are there going to be one queue? Is there going to be one queue for everybody from European countries? I ask because many people ask me these questions in my surgery.
Well, again, we will go into more detail on the rights of citizens within the second grouping, but what this is securing is the legal effects, the protections that apply to citizens within those EEA EFTA states. One of the big questions when the Brexit discussions that we've had repeatedly in place is to what extent will people's rights be protected. What this bill is doing so through Clause 5 for EU nationals. The purpose of Clause 6 is to mirror those protections in the law in direct effect for the EA EFTA states. Arrangements of the sort the Honourable Lady touches on are then a separate issue in terms of citizens' rights, but this is about how the legal protection will apply to those nationals. This clause gives effect in domestic law to the EA, EFTA and Swiss separation agreements in a similar way to the withdrawal agreement. This ensures that a Norwegian citizen living in the UK can rely on their rights in a UK court in broadly the same way as a Swedish citizen. It does so in the same way as Clause 5. We do not want a Norwegian, a Liechtenstein, an Icelandic, or indeed a Swiss national to have any lesser certainty in their rights than an EU national here, or indeed a UK citizen in Europe. And this clause also enshrines the legal certainty to businesses and individuals covered by the EA EFTA agreement, which Article 4 of the withdrawal agreement provides. This clause, in its presented form, is vital to the UK's implementation of the EA, EFTA and Swiss agreements. It must stand part of the bill. Turning, Mr Deputy Speaker, to Clause 33, which prohibits the UK agreeing to an extension of the implementation period. Let me read from page 5 of the Conservative Manifesto. We will not extend the implementation period beyond December 2020. And now let me read from the text of Clause 33. A Minister of the Crown may not agree to the Joint Committee to an extension of the implementation period. It could not be clearer. This government is determined to honour its promise to the British people and to get Brexit done. Yeah. Both the EU and the UK committed to a deal by the end of 2020 in the political declaration. Now, with absolute clarity on the timetable we are working to, the UK and the EU will be able to get on with it. In sum, this clause will ensure we will meet the timetable as set out in the political declaration and deliver on our manifesto promise. For this reason, this clause must stand part of the bill.
I understand why the clause is there, and much as I'm a Remainer, I remain a Remainer and I'll remain a Remainer until my dying day, nonetheless, I accept that the second referendum has now happened. That is the end of that. However, I do have an anxiety which was first expressed, in a sense, by the former Prime Minister when she wrote the first letter of intent with regard to Article 50, which stated that if we didn't have a deal, a full deal, meaning by the end of the implementation period, we would have trouble in relation to security issues. I just asked the government to think very carefully about how we're going to make sure that there is a security deal covering all the range of security issues that face this country by the end of this year, because that is as important, I would argue, as the trade-related issues.
Well, first, could I welcome the constructive way that the Right Honourable put that question in terms of his security, but recognising the general election mandate and how that does play into this clause and its reflection of the manifesto. In terms of addressing his concern, I would draw his attention to two things. Firstly, the withdrawal agreement itself commits both sides, including the European Union, to using their best endeavours to reach agreement. But secondly, the political declaration actually sets out the timescale to the end of 2020 in terms of their commitment to that as a timescale. So that is why we are confident this can be done in the timescale, and that is a reflection, of course, that is a reflection of both the commitments that the UK and indeed the EU have given in the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration itself.
Does the Secretary of State agree that when both parties to a negotiation are willing to take forward the negotiation in good spirit, all things are possible? Indeed, in a briefing to EU politicians in November of last year, Michel Barnier himself said that the timescale would normally be too short, but that Brussels would strive to have a deal in place by the end of 2020. It is clearly possible to do this deal for the end of 2020. Does he not agree that that is the right approach to take?
Well, I very much agree with my honourable friend, and indeed the Commission President will be meeting with the Prime Minister tomorrow. I'll be meeting with Michel Barnier in terms of acting on that constructive spirit. Both sides have committed, as I say, to that timescale. And indeed, there are many voices who, and I'm conscious, I think the House is in a different place to where it was previously, but there are many within the House that will recall that it was often said it was impossible to reach agreement before when indeed an agreement was reached. I give way to the Honourable. I've already given way to the Honourable Lady.
Minister, I thank the Minister for giving way. And can I first of all say I welcome the fact that the Government is determined to bring this process to an end by December of 2020. And I hope that that does concentrate minds in the European Union. But if the European Union and the Government can't come to an agreement by 2020, can you tell us, first of all, what are the implications for future arrangements? And secondly, what are the implications for the current withdrawal agreement, and especially for the provisions in Northern Ireland?
Well, firstly, I believe we can and we will, and as I've already indicated to the House, so does the EU, because they have committed in the political declaration to doing so. Secondly, to address his question, there are a number of issues that are addressed through this bill. So citizens' rights, which the Honourable Lady raised in terms of her own constituents, are protected through this bill. And so when people previously used to talk about a no-deal outcome, one of the things this bill does is secure the protection of the 3 million EU citizens that are valued within our country, but also of our own citizens, the over 1 million UK citizens there. And likewise, in terms of the Northern Ireland Protocol, and I know the Honourable Gentleman has concerns in respect of that, and I stand ready, as indeed do my ministerial colleagues, to continue to discuss issues with him, and we will debate that in more detail in committee tomorrow. But again, the Northern Ireland Protocol is secured through the passage of this bill. So that puts us in a very different place to where many of the debates were in the previous Parliament in respect of concerns that were respect in no deal. Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady.
to him for giving away again, and I would just remind him that just last month it was the Commission President who said that she has serious concerns about this timetable. All experts in trade are concerned that within an 11-month time period there simply isn't the time necessarily to get a good deal done. So why is he signing up now to something that he could at least postpone till June till he has a better sense of how negotiations are going, rather than cutting off his nose to spite his face by saying now that he will not extend the implementation period?
Well, first I'll move on because I think new clauses 4 and 36 also speak to the same point. But in short, for in part the reasons I've already given to the House in terms of what is set out in the political declaration, that there is a shared commitment there, but also because on this side of the House we gave a manifesto commitment to stick to this timetable. And I'm sure the Honourable Lady will be the first to criticise the government if it made a manifesto commitment and then decided not to stand by it. So we are committed to the commitment we gave on timescale, and that is why we want to move forward with clause 33. I'll just make a little progress, and then of course I'll always come to the Honourable Gentleman. So, turning to new clause 4 and 36 in the name, firstly, of the Leader of the Opposition and secondly in the name of the Leader of the Liberal Democrats. New clause 4 has been tabled by the Leader of the Opposition in an attempt to force the government to extend the implementation period if a deal has not been agreed with the EU by June the 15th. The clause also gives Parliament a vote on any such extension. New clause 36 on behalf of the acting Leader of the Liberal Democrats is very similar in effect to new clause 4, but it does so without having any parliamentary vote. So it states that a deal is required on both economic and security matters by June the 1st, or as an extension is mandated as a consequence of this legislation. The opposition parties therefore want to amend this bill to force further delay. Of course I give way and then I'll...
Thank you to my right. Does not agree with me, but it's absolutely astounding that so many members on the opposition benches didn't listen to the call from the people in the general election recently, but they are fed up of continuous delays and extensions, and that the message they gave us on the doorstep was to get Brexit done so we can all move on and so we can start talking about other things like our NHS, schools and our policing.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right that there was a very clear message that was reflected in the mandate. To be fair to the benches opposite, for example, when I watched the Shadow Brexit Secretary on the Andrew Marr programme, he did accept on his part the need to move on and indeed wanted to reflect. I'm giving credit. Before I chuntering away from it, I'm giving credit to my I appreciate his engagement on other matters at the moment in terms of his own party, but he recognised that. But my honourable friend is absolutely right that there was a clear desire from the British public to move on, to get on to the other priorities to which he referred. I will just take that, and then of course I'll always come to the honourable.
The Secretary of State for giving way. Isn't the danger, though, in setting this fixed date, is that it's going to have to make the government, the British government, is going to have to make a decision very quickly about what it wants to achieve in the second phase of Brexit? Is it going to go for close alignment? Possibly you could get the deal done in a year, but if it decides it's going to disalign, that creates difficulties, and then the best we can hope for, if not a no-deal cliff edge, is a bare-boned FTA, and that could be very bad news for the economy.
With respect to the honourable, we see it as a win-win. It's not, the EU wishes to trade with the UK, we wish to trade with the EU. They're our neighbours. We want to have a constructive relationship. But at the same time, people voted for change. And they want to see change, and this government is delivered through this bill to delivering the change that the British public voted for.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Does he agree with me that it's not only the British people who are fed up with seeing this Parliament going round and round in circles on Brexit, which is why they voted for the Conservative Party in the last general election, but also people in many European countries who just want to get on and get past Brexit. They want a trade deal with us. We should agree one quickly and move on.
My honourable friend, who speaks always with authority as a former member of the European Parliament, is absolutely right in understanding that this is not just a desire of the British public, but also of many of our friends and neighbours in Europe that do want to see the debate move forward and therefore want to see this delivered. And that is why it is right that we have this clause and why these new clauses are inappropriate. Of course, I give way.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Would he not agree with me that the negotiations going on with the European Union on the free trade agreement will be relatively easy on goods, but the negotiations on services will be much more complicated, mainly because goods, there is obviously we have a balance of trade deficit with the European Union, but on services we have a balance of trade improvement there.
What I say to and this is why I refer back to the remarks I gave a moment ago about this being a win-win for both sides. If I take a portfolio that I used to deal with as a minister in terms of financial services, then it is in the interests of EU businesses to be able to access capital at the cheapest possible price. I see the member for Wimbledon, who I know has expertise in this regard. He knows that actually the expertise of the global markets, the liquidity that London offers, is of benefit not just to the rest of the world, but it is a benefit to colleagues in European businesses. They want to have access to the talent of my honourable friends, constituents and many others, and that is why it's in both sides' interest to reach agreement, and that is a discussion the Prime Minister will be having with the Commission President tomorrow.
Thank my right honourable friend for giving way. Isn't the problem for those of us who have been very clear about our opposition to no deal, the problem with new clauses 4 is that effectively it takes away some of the certainty and benefits to business because it opens the possibility of an unended extension. And the problem with new clause 36 is it's anti-democratic. And therefore any colleagues who think that there may need to be these in place should recognise this would undermine the whole purpose of this withdrawal agreement, and the best way to stop a no deal is to secure a deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah, honourable friend is absolutely right. I mean, he knows, and I know he engages very extensively with the business community. And what the business community want is the clarity, the certainty that this bill delivers, and they also want an implementation period, but that has a clear demarcation in terms of its time, and that is what this bill will deliver. I'll give way one further time to the chair of this.
I'm very grateful to the Secretary of State for giving way. He's expressed enormous confidence that a deal will be done by December. Can I just test that confidence a little further? Would he give the House an assurance today that there is no prospect whatsoever of the UK leaving without an agreement in December of this year?
So, well, what I've set very clear, and the right honourable gentleman will have studied the bill, he always does, and he will know exactly what is in clause 33, which is a commitment that we will stick to the timetable set out in respect to the implementation period and what we committed to in our manifesto. And I would hope he, as a Democrat, would want a government to adhere to its manifesto. The reality, Mr Deputy Speaker, is on December the 12th, the British public voted in overwhelming numbers to get Brexit done by the 31st of January and to conclude the implementation period by December 2020 so we can look forward to a bright future as an independent nation. Page 5 of our manifesto explicitly states that we will negotiate a trade agreement by next year, one that will strengthen our union, and we will not extend the implementation period beyond December 2020. We are delivering on these promises that the British people have entrusted us to deliver, and the opposition is only interested in further delay and disruption. I urge the right honourable members to withdraw both amendments. Mr Deputy Speaker, I look forward to hearing from members across the House as we take through committee the groupings that we are addressing. This government is committed to delivering Brexit, and this bill will enable us to do so.
Order. Just before I call Mr Blomfield, I should probably have indicated, for the benefit of new members particularly, and will indicate now that clause 33 will not be decided today. Although it is grouped with these amendments, it will be taken as a Committee of the Whole House decision tomorrow, and may or may not be divided upon. I want to make that clear. It won't be that we've forgotten it. We might have done, but we haven't. Paul Blomfield.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Roger. It's a pleasure to rise to speak to new clause 4 primarily, and to have the opportunity to correct the misrepresentation that the Secretary of State has given to our objectives in moving it. It's also a pleasure to do so with you in the chair, Sir Roger, and I want to take this opportunity to thank you and indeed all the clerks for the work that has been done to ensure we're able to debate the issues within this bill today, and much of that work done over the recess when other people were enjoying the break. I have to say how much we regret that the government have provided so little time to debate a considerable number of amendments, all tabled because they will have profound consequences for our country for generations to come. Our proposals over the next 2 days echo the concerns expressed in the last Parliament and reflect the approach that has guided us as an opposition over the last 4 difficult and divisive years. I will.
Grateful to him for giving way, but he says that the principles that have guided him, surely they're the principles that have misguided him and his party. Does he not understand that actually the political landscape has changed as a result of the general election? As the Secretary of State said, people want to get Brexit done. They don't want further delay, which is all that his new clause and new clause 36 would bring.
I had hoped for a better initial intervention because we are very clear that we accept that the general election has changed the landscape. The Shadow Secretary of State for exiting the European Union has made that position clear. Other colleagues have made that position clear, and I will in my remarks. I think members opposite also ought to recognise that although under our electoral system the arithmetic in this place is very clear, the majority of the British people voted for parties that weren't of the mind of the Conservative Manifesto and who wanted to give the British public a further say. And I say that only, not to deny the reality of the voting in this place, but that the members opposite ought to have some caution about the way that they approach this issue and claim authority from the British people. I will, of course. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, I'm most grateful. Thank you. I just wanted to clarify one thing from the honourable member, and that is this. Of course, the opposition Labour front bench and the whole of the Labour Party, with few exceptions, if any, voted against the repeal of the European Communities Act 1972. Does he first of all confirm that that was the case? Because I don't think he can deny it. And the second thing is, doesn't that actually make it clear that they were always against? That is, back in 2018, when the royal assent for that act was passed, actually were refusing to accept the will of the British people, and furthermore, that they would not repeal the 72 Act.
Well, I'm always happy to confirm what's on the public record, but I would say that we were clear as an opposition that we campaigned to remain in the European Union because we believed that that was the right thing for our country, for the continent that we share with the other members of the EU. But we accepted the outcome of the referendum and voted to trigger Article 50 and believed that there would have been the possibility of both winning an overwhelming majority in this House and uniting the British people around a departure from the European Union which reflected the 52-48 vote of a divided country in 2016, a decision that would have taken us out of the European Union but remained close, aligned with the single market, in a customs union, and continuing to be part of the agencies and partnerships that we built together over 46 years. That sort of deal was available, and it's members opposite who denied it. But let me move forward to say why we voted against this bill at second reading, because we believe that this withdrawal agreement is a bad deal for the UK, just as we voted against previous withdrawal agreements. And it is worth remembering, when members opposite point fingers, that we weren't alone in that. Albeit for very different reasons, it was many members opposite, including the Prime Minister, who voted more than once against getting Brexit done on the terms of the previous Prime Minister's deal and for his own reasons. I will indeed.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and I appreciate the sentiment in his speech and the way that he describes events in the last few years. Will he agree with me that our duty now as a responsible opposition is to make these very points and to point out to the government, however large their majority is, where there are issues of substance where we disagree and where the interests of the United Kingdom are not being pursued effectively by the government?
Well, I very much agree with that. I think that there needs to be a voice for the approaching 55% of people in this country who were uncomfortable with the direction that the Conservative Party manifesto offered. And whilst the result of the general election was clear, it doesn't mean that the government can proceed without question, without challenge, without scrutiny. And that is the point of many of the amendments that we are tabling. I will give way one more time and then make some progress.
Thank you. My honourable friend is making an excellent speech, and the tone of it is just right for the debate and where we find ourselves within the debate. But could I just also press the question, which is wider, around scrutiny? We will shortly have no Brexit Scrutiny Committee, or whenever the committees are going to reform. There's a lot of detail, and having sat on the Trade Committee myself, I know that there's a lot of mistakes that can be made at the beginning in terms of a forward-looking trade deal. And I fear that rushing into it like this, not allowing Parliament much time to debate some of the principles at the beginning and giving the government a tiny implementation period, could lead to a much worse outcome compared to taking a little bit more time, being more thoughtful and giving a genuine role to Parliament around those new arrangements.
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she's right to focus on the issue, because the government has seemed a little reluctant to embrace the idea of scrutiny and accountability since October in so very many ways. And I hope that they will think seriously, quite genuinely, over the period ahead to ensure that there is proper opportunity for this House to question and debate the direction of travel. I will, for one last time.
I'm very grateful, and I'm glad we have got this opportunity for the opposition to make their points. Can't the opposition see that trying to take away the proposition that we leave come what may at the end of the year completely undermines the British negotiating position? Absolutely. Every time we have amendments over 3.5 years, it's always to do Britain down and to leave us in a weak position.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I mean, the right honourable member and I have had previous exchanges about comments that he might have made about doing Britain down. But I think the position that we have, yes, we have. I think the position that we've taken is that possibly it's not always the best idea to jump off a cliff. That if we find ourselves in the position, and I'll develop the argument obviously as I go forward, if we find ourselves in a position where we are, for the sake of weeks or months, unable to have secured a deal which is in the interest of the British economy, then the sensible thing to do is to give ourselves a little bit of flexibility. He may think otherwise, but that's not our view. If I could make... Go on.
And then I'll make some progress. Would he accept that for many people listening to the argument which he's making, that this is not a case of a fear of jumping over the cliff, but more a case that the opposition to leaving the EU want us to have our feet firmly stuck in the mud of the EU forever, and that's the reason why he wants a further extension?
Well, I thank the honourable member for that intervention, because it gives me the opportunity to say that's absolutely not the case. We accept that we are leaving the European Union in 3 weeks' time. End of. But that's not the end of Brexit, because we are going to have considerable discussion in this place, and the government will be involved in negotiations over some time to come over the future relationship. And it's the future relationship which is the concern behind new clause 4, because we have consistently sought to oppose any proposals which risk damaging people's jobs and livelihoods. It was why we voted against the deal proposed by the previous Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead. The current Prime Minister may have voted against her for different reasons. But it's why we voted against the deal also proposed by the current Prime Minister in the last Parliament. And since its introduction in October, this withdrawal agreement bill has only got worse. In our view, much worse. It grants expansive power to ministers and severely diminishes any role for Parliament in the crucial period ahead. It removes our role in approving the government's negotiating mandate and voting on the final treaty. Protections for workers' rights have been ditched, I think confirming that the TUC were right to dismiss government previous promises as, and I quote, meaningless procedural tricks. The new Northern Ireland Protocol undermines the UK's internal market, something that the Prime Minister had promised his former allies, faithfully that he was committed to protecting. Shamefully, the government has removed the requirement to negotiate an agreement with the EU on unaccompanied children seeking asylum. And the government has not only removed any role for Parliament in deciding whether to extend the implementation period, it's now specifically prohibiting ministers from agreeing an extension through clause 33, as the Secretary of State pointed out. So, no deal is back on the table, as I think the Secretary of State confirmed in his response to my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central. And it's that risk that new clause 4 is attempting to address. Now, we don't plan to push new clause 4 to a vote this evening, but it is intended to provide an opportunity for the government to come back to this House with their proposals, perhaps at report stage, on how we avoid the catastrophe of no deal at the end of this year. Now, it is a reflection of the unfortunately polarised discourse on Brexit that reflected in some of the contributions earlier, that new clause 4 was described in some sections of the media at the end of last week as an, I quote, an attempt to delay leaving the EU by 2 years. It is no such thing. We recognise, and as I've made the point earlier, that the general election result means we are leaving the European Union on the 31st of January. But what happens thereafter is crucial to our economy, to jobs and to people's livelihoods, whether they voted leave or whether they voted remain. I will.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. He says he recognises the decision that the electorate took last month, but does he not accept that there was a very clear mandate to conclude the implementation period by the end of this year, which was clearly in the Conservative Manifesto, that has clearly been elected with a significant majority to this House?
Well, I'm not sure if the honourable gentleman was listening to the point that I made earlier. I'm very clear on the electoral arithmetic, but he should also be clear that there is significant concern among the British people, represented by almost 55% of those who cast their vote in the general election, about the future direction, and there is no mandate for leaving the European Union without a deal. I will, and then I'll make some progress.
I don't think anyone can doubt my credentials as being concerned about and opposed to no deal. But the trouble with his remarks, so they would have greater validity if he were to have attacked a new clause for the consequence or the potential of a very short extension necessary for the conclusion of a future relationship, as he was beginning, I think, to say, rather than, as new clause 4 does, a completely open-ended extension, and therefore not surprisingly being described as an extension to Brexit. And the key thing would have been, if he wanted to stop no deal, he should vote for a deal, and he should do that again now.
Well, I don't question the honourable member's credentials in terms of his concern about leaving without a deal, but I would ask him to look carefully at new clause 4. The framing in relation to 2 years builds on the provisions of the withdrawal agreement to which the government has signed up, but includes the capacity for a much shorter transitional period if the government is successful in concluding a deal or if this House agrees. So our proposal in new clause 4 very much addresses the point that he's making, and I'll come to that in more detail, and he might want to intervene again at a later point. I mean, it was because of the risks, Sir Roger, of a disorderly departure that we were first to argue, it seems like a very long time ago now, for a transition period, which was at that stage opposed by the government. We were raising the voice of business and of the trade unions, and we were pleased when the government accepted that principle, although saving face by renaming it an implementation period. But when the end of the transition was originally set for December 2020, it was on the assumption that we would have left the EU on the 29th of March last year, leaving 21 months. Well, the Honourable Member for Sedentary Position says, why didn't we? He could ask that of a number of his colleagues, including the Prime Minister. It would have left 21 months to negotiate our new relationships on trade and, as my old friend from the Ronda pointed out, on security in particular. Now, that was seen, 21 months, was seen as ambitious. Many in the government sitting around the cabinet table doubted its deliverability. It's why there was a provision to extend it. But now there is only 11 months, and in trade negotiation terms, 11 months is unbelievably short. Now, the governments say that they want an ambitious, best-in-class free trade agreement. They talk about CETA as a model, but not about the time taken to negotiate CETA, of which they're well aware. Now, they say it's going to be easy to negotiate because we start from the unique position in trade talks of existing alignment, and the Honourable Member is nodding. And we do. But we are also uniquely, it's the government's objective, to diverge from that alignment, to seek a deal that allows the UK to race to the bottom, undercutting the EU on obligations and regulations and stepping off the level playing field. That is going to be uniquely difficult to negotiate. And any deal secured in 11 months is highly likely not to be a good deal for the UK. I will.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way, and I think he's making a very important point here, because essentially this will be the first trade deal in history where the aim is to put up barriers rather than remove them. So rather than being an easy process, isn't it likely to be convoluted and difficult?
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for that intervention. I agree absolutely with him.
Thank you very much. Would the Honourable Member agree with me? You only need to look at the NAFTA renegotiation, which was a negotiation from a basis of a trade deal that has taken almost 2 years now and still hasn't yet fully completed, to get an answer of how long it takes to negotiate a trade deal when one already exists and economies are already partly aligned.
Well, I thank my friend for that intervention, and he's right. And I fear that the government platitudes around the ease of negotiating this deal skirt over the real challenges that will be faced and the real need for some flexibility, some provision to avoid the cliff edge. Of course, well, if I could make some progress, I've been fairly generously giving away. If I can make some progress, and then I'll take further interventions. Under the provisions of the withdrawal agreement, as the Secretary of State has pointed out, any extension to the transition period must be agreed by the 1st of July 2020, so only 5 months after negotiations have begun. Now, I fully accept that in our concerns, we might be completely wrong. You know, the government might be able to negotiate a best-in-class free trade agreement within 11 months. If that is the case, and they are able to secure a deal, then there will be no extension under the provisions of our new clause. So what are they worried about? If the government are confident, well, the Secretary of State's finding this funny, but if the government are confident in their ability to agree a comprehensive future relationship with the European Union, then I hope that they'll have no problem in returning to the House with proposals along the lines of those outlined in new Clause 4. I will.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. When he says that it's a race to the bottom, surely he is showing his own prejudice in the sense that he doesn't want the United Kingdom to devolve itself of any unnecessary regulations which have been imposed on this country over the last 47 years.
Well, I was quite involved in the debate during the referendum, And I listened carefully to what many of those on government